Whispers of History, an immersive journey through medieval inns and the rise and fall of empires. Close your eyes. Imagine stepping back in time, not to a grand palace or a mighty battlefield, but to a place far more real, more raw, and infinitely more aromatic. Tonight, we open the door to a medieval inn, a place where tired travelers met suspicious stew, where ale flowed freely, and so did lice, and where half your night was spent wondering whether that groan upstairs was someone snoring or dying. So, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1: The Daily Grind of a Medieval Inn. Section 1: Dawn at the Inn. It's not so much that the innkeeper wakes up, it's that he is awakened, perhaps by the gentle sound of someone sneezing directly onto the floorboards below his room, followed by a groan, a crash, and the unmistakable clatter of a chicken escaping through the front door. Again, he opens one eye. It's still dark out, which means it's either too early or too late. There's no in-between in medieval timekeeping. He sits up slowly, peeling himself off a straw mattress that smells faintly of garlic and last Tuesday's ale. His bed isn't bad, just simple, cozy in the way a slightly damp cloak is cozy. If you don't ask too many questions, he dresses in stages: tunic, trousers, then the belt. If he can find it, after a brief search, he locates it hanging on a peg behind the door, along with a spoon, a candle nub, and someone's sock. He doesn't ask whose. Asking questions before sunrise is a mistake. Downstairs, the common room is unnervingly quiet. Signs of life: a tipped mug, a boot near the hearth, a man snoring under a table, with the confidence of someone who's done this before. The innkeeper steps carefully around him. Waking guests too early often leads to awkward sword-point discussions. He stokes the hearth with a practiced flick of the poker. The goal is warmth, not a roaring blaze. Firewood is expensive. The last time he got a real blaze going, someone tried to cook a goose on it indoors, with feathers still on, as he sets a pot over the flames, ready to reheat whatever last night's stew has evolved into. He hears the distant bray of a mule and the clump of early travelers arriving. He exhales. The inn isn't glamorous, but it's warm, it's busy, and most importantly, it's his. And just like that, the day begins again. Section 2: The Taste of Medieval Life. Breakfast at the inn is less a meal and more a negotiation between what's edible and what's legally defensible. The innkeeper ladles a thick scoop of something into a pot. It doesn't have a name, but it does have a smell, somewhere between boiled oats and a wet boot that's been thinking about cabbage. This is pottage, a medieval staple, not a recipe so much as a concept. Yesterday's pottage was made with barley and turnips. Today's includes those same turnips, now softer, and some mysterious bits from a goose that failed to escape last night. Add water, heat, repeat. It's like soup. If soup gave up halfway, the bread is present, hard as a roof tile, and just as chewable. It's cut with care, mostly because the innkeeper doesn't want to break another knife on it. Guests chew it slowly, partly for digestion, partly because there's time to reflect on their life choices between bites and the ale. Oh yes, breakfast beer. It's not a medieval cliché. It's a necessity. The water here is questionable. The milk is reserved for the Lord's barn cat. And tea is still a twinkle in some far-off merchant's eye. The ale is weak, but at least it's been boiled and filtered through sheer desperation. Even the children drink it with supervision. Of course, this is a reputable establishment. After all, by now, guests are drifting in. A merchant with a coin purse clutched like a holy relic. A sleepy pilgrim muttering about blisters. And inevitably, the bard who requests honey for his porridge, as though honey hasn't been locked in a chest for weeks. The barmaid, Marjorie, agile and immune to nonsense, moves between tables like a dancer who's had enough. She smiles at patrons, refills mugs, and dodges unsolicited compliments with the grace of someone who has memorized every possible bad poem a drunk traveler can recite. By the end of breakfast, the inn smells like smoke, barley, and ambition. Stomachs are foolish. Spirits are lukewarm. It's not fine dining, but it's hot, filling, and nobody's died yet, which, by medieval standards, is a triumph. Section 3. The Unfolding Day. If there's one thing a medieval inn doesn't need more of, it's people. Yet by mid-morning, they began to pour in, like pigeons with luggage, and about the same regard for personal hygiene. First through the door is a knight, or rather, someone claiming to be a knight. He has armor, yes, but it's mismatched, rusty, and held together with what looks like curtain rope. He demands a private room, despite having no coin, no manners, and the general scent of a horse that lost a bet. Behind him is a merchant's apprentice, who talks like he owns a fleet of ships, but pays with buttons. He tries to haggle over a bowl of soup, as though this establishment offers Groupon deals. Then comes the bard. Every inn has one. He never actually pays, but insists that his songs are worth more than gold. They aren't. He carries a lute, 6 strings missing, and immediately launches into a mournful tune about lost love and goat theft. Nobody asked for this. A monk shuffles in next, nodding solemnly at everyone and blessing the furniture. He insists on fasting loudly while eyeing the bread. Within 10 minutes, he's eating said bread, and explaining that technically it's not a sin if the loaf was already broken. By noon, the inn is full of clashing personalities and overlapping smells. Someone is drying their socks near the hearth. Someone else is sharpening a knife. For no clear reason, a child runs between tables, pursued by a goose with a grudge. In the corner, two travelers argue over who gets the only stool without a wobble, and overseeing it all is the innkeeper. Calm as a monk on payday, he's seen it all before. He knows that by evening, someone will fall in love, someone will fall asleep in their soup, and someone will challenge a stool to a duel. Probably the bard again. He pours another mug, wipes the counter with a cloth that has seen better centuries, and gives a nod to Marjorie. A silent agreement that, despite everything, this place is still running. The guests may be unpredictable, loud, occasionally bleeding, but they're also what makes the inn, and he wouldn't have it any other way, except quieter, and with fewer goose chases. Marjorie, the inn's soul. If the inn has a soul, or at least a functioning brain, it's the barmaid, Marjorie. She's about 20, possibly 30, or maybe she just aged rapidly from exposure to traveling poets. No one knows for sure. What people do know is that the entire operation would collapse into a stew-soaked heap. Without her, she moves through the chaos with practiced precision, one hand balancing a tray of mugs, the other swatting a wandering hand that misjudged her patience. Her reflexes are faster than a ferret in a pantry. A drunken mercenary once tried to compliment her ankles and woke up 2 days later with his boots nailed to the ceiling. Marjorie can take an order in for dialects, pour ale without spilling a drop, and insult a noble without technically committing treason. She's not rude. She's efficient, and in a building held together by splinters and half-promises, she is the only one with actual authority. She knows which travelers will pay in coin, and which will try to barter with seashells. She can sniff out a fake accent, a stolen ring, and a flirt disguised as a food complaint. The monk may mumble about sign, but even he knows. Marjorie is the patron saint of keeping things moving. Her day starts before dawn and ends long after the fire burns low. In that time, she serves stew, chase children, bandage a scraped knee, and somehow find time to refill every mug in the room, often while dodging falling cutlery or calming down an argument about who owns the goat that wandered in during lunch. And yet, she never drops the tray. That's the magic of it. Marjorie doesn't run the inn on paper, but in practice, it's her kingdom. The innkeeper might own the walls, but she controls the floor. A wink here, a sharp word there, a stare that can curdle milk. It's a delicate dance, and she performs it daily with the kind of grace that only comes from years of low expectations and high tolerance. Section 4. dusk to darkness, supper time arrives, not with elegance, but with nose, loud, overlapping nose. Chairs scrape, mugs clink. Someone coughs theatrically to hint that they've been waiting ages, even though they arrived 9 minutes ago and are still wearing their traveling cloak like it's a crown. Marjorie emerges from the kitchen, holding a pot that's technically still warm and definitely still stew. The day's menu hasn't changed. It's still the inn's signature dish, whatever was left from earlier, slightly reheated. This stew tastes different than last night, one traveler says with suspicion. It's the same stew, Marjorie replies without looking up. Oh, well, it's nice, they add quickly, now fearing for their cutlery privileges. The bard, who is still here somehow, offers to perform a song in honor of the meal. He gets through one verse before Marjorie places a ladle in his bowl. With a little more enthusiasm than necessary, he gets the message. The stew is filling. The ale flows freely, which helps with how filling the stew is, and despite the occasional complaint about texture, temperature, or the existential ambiguity of the meat, everyone eats. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, polishing a mug that hasn't been truly cleaned since last harvest, watching his patrons with the expression of a man who has accepted his fate. He knows that in about an hour, someone will spill something, someone else will fall asleep mid-sentence, and the bard will try again. He always tries again. But for now, the room is loud, messy, and very much alive, which is, if nothing else, a sign of success, because in a medieval inn, supper doesn't need to be good. It just needs to arrive without catching fire as the last spoon clinks against the bottom of a bowl, and guests begin to lean back with the satisfied groans of people who survived another round of stew. The real show begins. Evening entertainment, loosely defined. There is no scheduled program, no flyers, no host with a lute and a schedule. The evening simply unfolds, the way all great performances do, with no structure, limited talent, and a strong chance of mild injury. The bard, of course, seizes the moment. He clears his throat dramatically, plucks 3 uncertain strings, and announces a ballad titled, "The Fair Lady of Fasterwell, Who Married a Troll." Half the room cheers, the other half groans. The goat sneezes. His voice is enthusiastic. The lyrics rhyme occasionally. The innkeeper pours himself a mug of ale and drinks deeply, the way a man does when he knows there are still 6 verses to go, and at least one of them will involve sock theft. There is no official closing time at the inn. There's no bell, no lights out announcement, number. Closing time is more of a gradual societal collapse. It begins when the bard finally loses his audience, usually when he forgets the lyrics to the final verse. and replaces them with dramatic throat noises. Someone throws a crust of bread in appreciation. It's unclear whether it's applause or a bribe to stop. A few patrons start to slump, not from ale necessarily, but from sheer caloric weight. The stew has settled. Gravity has won. Marjorie starts stacking empty mugs, like she's building a small fortress. She doesn't say much, just raises one eyebrow, which in the language of innkeeping means, wrap it up or start sweeping. The innkeeper begins his rounds. He pokes at the dying fire, checks that no one has passed out face down in the pot again, and gently nudges a snoring traveler off a table and onto a bench. A professional move, learned through years of subtle repositioning. Eventually, the room empties, not all at once, but in soft, wobbly waves, like a tide of cloaks, yawns, and the occasional hiccup. The chatter fades, the laughter dies down, the inn grows quiet, sort of, but for now. The worst of the day is over. The guests are asleep, or at least horizontal, and no longer speaking. Chapter 2. The Dutch Golden Age, a Tiny Republic's Giant Leap. Section 1. Birth of a New Power. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was about the size of a pancake and just as flat. But don't let geography fool you. This modest patch of reclaimed swamp was about to punch far above its weight, while the rest of Europe was busy stabbing each other over religion and whose king had the shinier boots. The Dutch quietly built an empire of light, money, and oil paint. It started with a revolution. Spain had been bossing the Netherlands around for decades, waving the Catholic flag and squeezing taxes out of every fish and tulip bulb. But by 1648, after nearly 80 years of kicking and screaming, the Dutch finally declared, "We're done." And just like that, they were free. What followed was less of a national plan and more of an entrepreneurial free-for-all. Imagine Silicon Valley, but everyone wears wooden shoes and invests in herring. Amsterdam became the Wall Street of Europe. Its ports were crowded with ships headed to Asia, Africa, the Americas, anywhere with goods to trade. The Dutch East India Company, basically the Amazon Prime of the 17th century, made fortunes off nutmeg, porcelain, and, let's not forget, colonization. But the real twist, while their ships were hauling cinnamon across oceans, back home, people were reading newspapers, sipping beer, and watching their neighbors get immortalized in oil by guys named Rembrandt and Vermeer. These painters didn't just make portraits, they made legends. Art wasn't just for kings anymore. Merchants wanted portraits, too. Even butchers could afford a nice still life, with a pig's head and a lemon. Tasteful. Section 2. The Merchant Empire Hidden Costs. If the Dutch Golden Age had a beating heart, it wasn't in a palace or a parliament. It was in the docks. Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Hoorn, Delft. These weren't just cities. They were launch pads for global domination, with sails and spreadsheets, while France was polishing its wigs, and Spain was still counting its gold. The Dutch were busy inventing capitalism, one logbook at a time. Their secret weapon, the merchant fleet, at its peak. The Dutch had more ships than any other nation on earth, possibly more than common sense should allow. These were armed merchant ships, sleek and practical, loaded with cannon and cargo space, carrying everything from silk to spices. The Dutch East India Company (VOC) was the world's first multinational corporation. Shareholders, stock markets, dividends. Yes, it was capitalism before it was cool or even ethical. The VOC did whatever it took to protect profit. Fortresses, private armies, and let's not sugarcoat it, some rather ruthless colonial tactics. The spice trade wasn't just cutthroat, it was decapitation friendly, and while the VOC was ruling the East, the West India Company was handling things in the Atlantic: sugar, rum, and slavery. The Dutch involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was not just incidental, it was systemic, calculated, and profitable. The same country commissioning paintings of milkmaids was also trading human lives on a ledger. The Golden Age had a deeply tarnished underside. Yet amid this brutal efficiency, the Dutch also brought a kind of order to global trade. Their ships sailed on set routes. Their cargoes were catalogued. Their ports were clean, secure, and shockingly well insured. They weren't just navigating oceans. They were navigating economics. While other countries sent explorers, the Dutch sent accountants with muskets. Their empire wasn't just built with swords. It was built with balance sheets. Section 3. Art, Ideas, and Urban Beauty. Next, we zoom into the velvet-lit world of Vermeer, where everyday life became eternal, while Dutch ships hauled goods across continents, and trading companies turned quarterly profits into golden chandeliers. Something else was happening, quietly, almost silently, in the towns and homes of the Dutch Republic. A girl poured milk. A woman laced her pearls. A letter was read in silence beside an open window. And with every mundane moment, a man named Johannes Vermeer turned ordinary life into eternal poetry. Vermeer wasn't the most famous painter of his day. In fact, he wasn't even the busiest. But what Vermeer lacked in volume, he made up for in radiance. His paintings are calm, composed, and eerily luminous, like someone painted sunlight holding its breath. What set him apart? Precision, detail, and a near mystical understanding of light. The interiors he painted weren't just backgrounds. They were characters. His works weren't flashy or political. They didn't shout. They whispered. And in those whispers were volumes about intimacy, solitude, and the quiet drama of domestic life. He painted what was often overlooked and made it unforgettable. beyond art. The Dutch didn't just ship goods, they shipped ideas in the 17th century. That was dangerous business at a time when publishing the wrong opinion could get you burned at the stake elsewhere. The Netherlands became a haven for writers, philosophers, and rebels with quills. The Dutch had a relatively tolerant attitude toward free thought, at least as long as it didn't mess with trade. Descartes wrote and published here Baruch Spinoza, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher, who suggested God was more like reality itself, lived and thought here in relative peace. This intellectual curiosity wasn't limited to scholars. The middle class read voraciously. For the first time in European history, literacy wasn't a luxury, it was a lifestyle. And finally, imagine a city built like a painting. Straight lines, soft curves, everything in its proper place, even the ducks. That was Amsterdam in the 17th century. The Dutch didn't just build cities, they drained them into existence. At the heart of this watery miracle was the canal ring, elegant and efficient. Rich merchants built narrow houses with steep steps and grand windows. Those tall houses with the ornate gables, they were tax strategies. Property taxes were based on width, not height. So, people built upward, not outward. The result, an architectural skyline that looks like gingerbread real estate and smells faintly of Calvinist restraint. Clean streets, tidy facades, order, and elegance. This was a built environment that reflected a national mindset, precise, practical, and quietly proud. Chapter 3. The Ancient Olympic Games, Glory, Sweat, and Gods. Section 1. The Sacred Start. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very first Olympic Games had none of that. No referees in Palas, no timers, no slow-motion replays, just dust, sweat, and a sacred olive tree. The year was 776 BCE, and the location was Olympia, a quiet religious sanctuary dedicated to none other than Zeus himself, the king of the gods, champion of lightning bolts, and apparent enthusiast for athletic thighs. These weren't just local games to pass the time between harvests. They were sacred, religious, even. The ancient Greeks didn't separate worship from physical excellence. In their eyes, competing naked in the heat of the Greek sun wasn't just showing off, it was divine devotion. To test the limits of your body in front of Zeus was the ultimate offering, one far more acceptable than sacrificing goats or writing hymns in hexameter. The first recorded event, the Stadion, a short-foot race roughly 600 feet long. The only known victor that year was a cook named Corobus of Elis. That's right, the first Olympic champion was a guy who probably trained by running between kitchens and slicing goat meat. He didn't get a trophy. He got an olive wreath, eternal glory, and the right to have poems written about his thighs. All competitors were Greek, male, and citizens. No women allowed to compete or even watch, unless they were priestesses. Married women caught sneaking and risked being hurled off a cliff, which feels a bit extreme even by ancient standards. But despite the simplicity, the stakes were enormous. To win at Olympia wasn't just a personal triumph. It brought glory to your polis, your city-state. You were no longer just a man. You were a hero, and heroes in ancient Greece lived forever. Section 2. Events, Rules, and Raw Power. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single-foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one guy sprinting 600 feet turned into a sprawling schedule of events that tested every aspect of the male body: speed, strength, balance, and how well you could fight someone half covered in olive oil. Running expanded to include the Dialos ancient 400-meter dash and the Dolichos, a long-distance race of up to 24 laps, over 5 kilometers in the Greek summer sun. Naked, no water breaks, no music playlists, just you, your feet, and probably some very uncomfortable dust. But it wasn't all about speed. The Greeks adored combat sports. Wrestling pale was a technical affair. No biting or eye-gouging. But pretty much everything else was fair game. You had to throw your opponent to the ground 3 times to win. It was the cerebral cousin of the far more chaotic pancration, a mix of boxing and wrestling where almost anything went. Punches, kicks, chokes, the rules. Try not to kill your opponent, at least not in front of the judges. Boxing pygmachia was brutal. No gloves, just leather straps wrapped around the knuckles. Matches often ended in blood and broken bones. Then there was the pentathlon, a 5-event spectacle for the ultimate all-rounder. Running, wrestling, long jump done with weights, javelin, and discus, and finally, chariot racing, held in the hippodrome. It was fast, dangerous, and occasionally fatal. The interesting twist: the owners of the horses won the prize, not the drivers. So, some aristocrat could pay a stable boy to risk his life for glory, and still take home the olive wreath. Classic. Each event pushed men to their limits, and sometimes past them. But they weren't competing for gold or money. They were chasing something even more valuable in ancient Greece: Cleos. Eternal fame. Section 3. The politics and the finish line. To the ancient Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing glistening biceps. They were, first and foremost, an act of worship. The athletes were pilgrims, and Olympia, a sacred site dedicated to Zeus. The most important structure was the Temple of Zeus, a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed a gigantic ivory and gold statue of the god, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It loomed over the games like a divine referee. The games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states Peleus to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international PR. Winning an event didn't just glorify the athlete, it glorified the polis he came from. One man's victory was a billboard for his hometown superiority. City-states even funded and trained athletes as a matter of prestige. These weren't amateurs jogging in from the olive grove. They were finely tuned instruments of civic propaganda. Political leaders used the games as a diplomatic platform. Treaties were discussed. Marriages were negotiated. Even military campaigns were timed around the sacred truce, or akacheria, a formal agreement that all Greek states would cease hostilities. In theory, it was Pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Sparta, naturally, was banned at least once for being too war-happy. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame, held every 4 years without fail. But even sacred traditions aren't immune to time. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had swallowed the Greek world. The games continued under Roman rule, but the original religious meaning began to fade. Then came a final blow. In 393 CE, Emperor Theodosius I, recently converted to Christianity, banned all pagan festivals that included the Olympics. After more than a millennium, the torch was snuffed out. The temples of Olympia were left to crumble. For centuries, the games lived only in legend, until, in the 19th century, that old flame flickered back to life, inspired by the spirit of ancient Greece. A Frenchman named Baron Pierre de Coubertin decided it was time to bring the games back. And so, in 1896, the modern Olympic Games were born in Athens. Today's games are bigger, louder, and significantly more clothed. But echoes of the original still remain. The 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lit at Olympia, the ideals of excellence, honor, and unity, and the pursuit of something greater than victory, immortality through achievement. It all began with a cook named Coroebus, a foot race, and a wreath of olive leaves beneath the gaze of Zeus. Chapter 4, The Whiskey Rebellion, America's First Real Test. Section 1, The Tax and the Fury. The year was 1791, and the United States was less a country and more a very expensive experiment. The revolution had been won, but the war had left behind a mountainous debt. The fledgling government, operating under the shiny new Constitution, was broke, and the question on everyone's mind was, who was going to pay for this? Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, who didn't just love strong financial systems. He worshipped them. Hamilton believed the key to national strength lay in federal authority and sound fiscal policy. His plan: consolidate state debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, and, here's the kicker, raise revenue through taxes, and not just any taxes, a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax. To Hamilton, it made perfect sense. Whiskey was widely produced, widely consumed, and, let's be honest, drank like water in many parts of the country, especially on the frontier where clean water wasn't always guaranteed. Taxing whiskey was like taxing sunshine. You could count on it. But out on the western frontier, particularly in western Pennsylvania, farmers had other ideas. Many small-scale farmers didn't just drink whiskey. They made it. They turned excess grain into liquor because it was easier to transport, preserved well, and could be used like currency. Whiskey was liquid gold, literally, and now the federal government was reaching deep into their pockets to take a cut. Worse yet, the tax disproportionately hit small distillers, the very people scraping by with homegrown copper stills and a handful of corn. Large producers could pay a flat fee. Small farmers had to pay per gallon. That felt like punishment by the bottle. To these men, this wasn't just a tax. It was a betrayal. The revolution had been fought over taxation without representation. And here was a distant government in Philadelphia telling them how to run their stills. Some called it tyranny. Others called it familiar. The seeds of rebellion were planted not in the halls of Congress, but in log cabins and backwoods taverns, where the talk turned from frustration to defiance. And all over whiskey. Section 2, The Rising Storm. To understand why Western farmers exploded over a whiskey tax, you have to understand the frontier mindset. Life west of the Alleghenies wasn't just hard. It was practically medieval. Roads were muddy trails. News took weeks to travel. And government was a rumor from a far-off land called Philadelphia. The whiskey still in the barn wasn't just a hobby. It was survival. Taxing it felt like taxing breath itself. So, farmers resisted. At first, it was low-key civil disobedience. Tax collectors were ignored. But then came the intimidation. Officials found themselves on the wrong end of tar barrels and angry mobs. In western Pennsylvania, resistance turned especially fierce. Collectors were harassed, threatened, or outright attacked. One was stripped, whipped, and left in the woods with feathers in his hair. A frontier-fashion statement with a clear message. Go home by 1793. It wasn't a protest anymore. It was open noncompliance, spreading across counties like spilled mash. What made it worse? Most of these people had fought in the Revolution. They had shed blood for independence, and now they were being taxed by a federal government that felt eerily similar to the monarchy they'd overthrown. Didn't we just do this? Was the unspoken, and sometimes shouted, sentiment. To them, Hamilton's tax was proof that the government didn't represent them. It was a challenge to the authority of the federal government under the Constitution. The rebellion raised a terrifying question. If a single region could defy a federal law with impunity. What kind of union had they really built? Section 3. Washington's Response and Legacy. By the fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had gone from a regional disturbance to a direct threat to the authority of the Constitution itself. In the East, elites feared the collapse of federal power. In the West, rebels were talking like revolutionaries, and in the middle stood President George Washington, watching his carefully stitched republic begin to unravel at the seams. This was the first real test of federal authority under the new Constitution. Washington understood what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, it would send a clear message. The federal government could be ignored, defied, and embarrassed. So, he made a decision that stunned the young nation. He would lead the army himself. Washington became, and remains, the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had once stepped down from power after the Revolution, this wasn't ego, it was necessity. He wanted to show that the Constitution wasn't just parchment. It had muscle. With Hamilton by his side, Washington mobilized a massive force of nearly 13,000 troops, larger than the entire Continental Army at its peak. As the army marched westward, the rebels began to scatter. Many had assumed the government would stay in Philadelphia and argue over letters. They hadn't expected muskets, drums, and a president on horseback. By the time the Federal Army reached western Pennsylvania, most of the rebellion had dissolved. The show of force had worked, but Washington didn't want blood. Once the region was secured, he handed command over and returned to Philadelphia. His point had been made. The government could and would defend its laws. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason. And then, in a twist that perfectly captured the political complexity of the moment, Washington pardoned both of them. Why? Because Washington knew something most revolutionaries turned presidents must eventually learn. Sometimes unity matters more than punishment. He had made his point. The law had been defended. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels might have turned them into martyrs, or worse, reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington extended mercy. It was calculated, yes, but also characteristic of his leadership style. Firm in principle, restrained in action. His goal wasn't vengeance. It was precedent, and that precedent was crystal clear. The federal government had the right to tax and the power to enforce. For the first time since the Constitution was ratified, the central authority had faced a challenge and passed the test. The political aftermath. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority. It exposed deep fractures in the new republic's identity. Hamilton saw the rebellion as proof that a strong central government was essential. His ideal America was industrial, urban, financially stable, and respected abroad. But Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, was appalled, not by the rebellion, but by Washington and Hamilton's military response to Jefferson, sending 13,000 troops to confront angry farmers over a liquor tax. Wasn't enforcement. It was intimidation. He feared that Hamilton's vision would create a nation run by bankers and elites. Jefferson's America was rural, decentralized, and rooted in the virtues of the independent farmer. The rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and James Madison began organizing opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be known as the Democratic Republicans, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty and the common man. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as mob sympathizers. The whiskey tax debate became shorthand for a larger struggle between centralized power and local autonomy. The tax remained, at least for a while, but its legacy would ripple through American politics for decades. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties, one of his first acts was repealing the whiskey tax. By 1802, it was gone. After all the drama, the military show of force, and the high-minded speeches about national authority, the whiskey tax barely worked. It had created massive political backlash, helped birth an opposition party, and stirred up anti-federal sentiment that would haunt the Federalists for years. Not exactly a win. The law had held, yes, but the people had spoken too, and for all its symbolism, the whiskey tax ultimately proved how fragile federal authority could be. When it ignored the lives of those on the margins, the muskets are long silent, the barrels empty, the tax repealed, but the legacy of the whiskey rebellion still lingers. Age, like the liquor that sparked it, it forced the country to answer uncomfortable questions. Could the federal government enforce its laws? Yes, but would doing so fracture the very unity sought to preserve? Also, yes, it highlighted the delicate balance between law and liberty, and showed that a republic doesn't run on paper alone. It runs on perception, participation, and trust. In that tension between enforcement and empathy lies the DNA of American politics. The line between governance and provocation is razor thin, and sometimes it runs straight through a glass of corn mash. History may have aged the whiskey, but the rebellion, it still burns,